everyone, and welcome to part 2 of our webinar series exploring how carbon credit schemes can transform sustainable practices in the livestock sector. So through the lens of Brazil's experience, we have been examining practical applications and opportunities for Ghana and Nigeria in this innovative space. And now I'll hand over to Professor Dominic Moran for the opening. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa.
Thank
you. As Vanessa said, I'm Dominic Moran. I'm now at the Division of Global Agriculture and Food Systems at the University of Edinburgh. We just acquired a new name. I'm just going to provide a series overview and locate you in reference to our first webinar. This is the second webinar. And as Vanessa said, we're exploring how carbon credit schemes can transform sustainable agricultural practices in the livestock sector. We started with looking at Brazil's experience because we thought Brazil had an advantage in other countries in the south, but we're now examining practical applications and opportunities for sub-Saharan Africa and Ghana and Nigeria in particular. This is an innovative space, so we have different expectations of what's going on in different countries. These webinars are part of a project called the Scoping Climate Smart Livestock Systems in Africa project. And as I said, this project seeks to examine the potential development of agricultural-based carbon credit schemes relevant to livestock in Brazil and, in our case, specifically Ghana and Nigeria. So what happened at the first webinar? I think we had a very interesting and insightful array of speakers who took us through mostly the Brazilian experience, but reflected more globally. What we learned from the webinar was that livestock offers numerous cost-effective greenhouse gas mitigation opportunities, and these range from animal breeding through to genetics, through to animal health and nutrition, and pasture management, and reversing land degradation in relation to livestock. We also learned that MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification, is complicated in this sector. The sector is biologically complex. It's spatially heterogeneous. Farms are all different, big and small. And this makes this market complicated, and because of that, buyers of potential credits see livestock and agricultural credits as potentially risky because they can't easily see or follow the process of monitoring, reporting, and verifying credits. This risk is compounded by limited regulatory oversight of credit markets. Generally, we can say, credit markets are being more formally regulated at different speeds across the world and in relation to different sectors, like energy, for example. But so far, there's very low representation of agricultural emissions projects certainly in formal markets, but also in the voluntary carbon market. So that seems like a lost opportunity. So the questions that arise because of that are, how do we de-risk credits in the agricultural sector and in relation to livestock? How do we reduce transactions costs? That's the relationship between buyers and sellers. How do we make sellers more visible? And how do we make buyers more confident that their transaction is going to have permanence and be reliable and be certifiable and valid as an offset or a credit? We talked about how we do this while trying to scale up. We are dealing with many small, medium, and large producers across the world, and we would like to offer credit at scale because transactions cost increase when we're dealing with many small producers and suppliers and many small individual transactions. So you want to actually reduce the costs by offering credits and emissions reductions at scale. And in a general sense, we talked about routes for benefit sharing between for example, with small producers in low-income contexts. And also there's potentially a gender angle in the benefit sharing discussion. In relation to Brazil in particular, we heard from our keynote speaker, Sinara Costa Jr., that the legislative framework for trading, carbon emissions trading, is now in place in Brazil, specifically in relation to large polluters and more easily identifiable and monitorable sectors like energy, but that agriculture is still largely outside this formal regulatory arrangement. And that's not surprising, because that's what we see in most countries of the world. For example, the European Union and to some extent the United States and Canada have had difficulty trying to work out where to fit agriculture more formally into formally regulated credit schemes. But that leaves the voluntary carbon market, and we heard also from the keynote that there are various methodologies for certifying actions that could be suitable for the voluntary carbon market, and anybody can enter the voluntary carbon market. All you need are buyers and sellers and some level of trust that there's a certification method allowing the buyer to trust the seller. But nevertheless, we saw from that presentation that there are few transactions involving agriculture, despite the huge mitigation potential in the sector. So the discussion revolved around the need to develop monitoring, reporting and verification methods, specifically in agriculture in relation to different activities in agriculture, and which reflect the emissions intensity of these different activities. So the emissions intensity of growing a hectare of maize will be different from rearing a herd of 1,000 or fewer Jersey cows. We also had a discussion about the need for considering how there is different sources of funding out there for different sorts of offset and credit. So there's the formal carbon market, there's the voluntary carbon market, but there's also a whole industrial sector that's considering ways of offsetting and insetting emissions within and inside businesses. And how do these different forms of credit and measurable offset attract different forms of funding into the sector? And then finally, we signed off by saying that all of this really depends on overall compliance within countries or of their climate commitments. So that's the overall envelope of emissions reduction that countries have signed up to. And if you think about that emissions envelope, that's what makes the pressure for within country activities to go and seek offsetting arrangements. So that was what we learned in the first webinar, and that leads us to the second webinar today, where we're looking more focused in a more focused way at what might be happening in sub-Saharan Africa and what the potential is for developing livestock or land-based credits in Ghana and Nigeria. So the questions for today are: what is the status of carbon credits and carbon trading, emissions trading or credit trading in sub-Saharan Africa? And here we're probably going to be focusing on any sector, specifically energy, formally regulated sectors in countries which have got carbon budgets or emissions budgets in place and regulations to try and meet carbon budgets. We have to bear in mind that many countries in the global south are not formally required to report emissions in the same way as some of the OECD or northern industrialized countries. Second question is: how far has the voluntary or regulated carbon market developed anywhere in Africa? Why is there slow uptake in agriculture and livestock in particular of the opportunities for crediting emissions reductions? We can imagine that many of these reasons will be some of the ones we discussed in the first webinar. What is the status of measuring and monitoring carbon and greenhouse gas emissions in the land-based sector in Ghana and Nigeria? And finally, what are the barriers to market development? Who are the sellers? Who's almost mature in terms of being able to sell emissions credits from the land-based sector? And who are the potential buyers, both in the public and the private sector. So that was the overview of webinar 1, and we would want to go in webinar 2. Now I need to introduce our speakers. Just to check, we've got a nice slide showing our speakers. Hopefully they're all online. We have a very interesting panel. We have Daniel Lamptey, who's the Principal Program Officer at the Ghana Environmental Protection Agency and Carbon Market Office. So by the sounds of it, Ghana has made particular progress in terms of developing its institutions in this space. We then have Olly Owen, who's Technical Advisor in Forestry and Climate Change at Ekiti State Government in Nigeria. We have Olivia Marques, who's Head of Operations at ERA, which is the Ecosystems Regeneration Associates in Brazil, a certification body, or at least a body seeking to bring credits to market or to buyers. We have Francisco Obreque, the lead rural development specialist at the World Bank. We then have Jack Devlin, who's Red Plus manager at the Africa Nature Investors Foundation, based in Nigeria. Then we have Ibrahim Umar Wali, Deputy Director of Nigeria's Federal Ministry of Agriculture and Food Security. He's followed by Robert Galevo, a consultant and researcher working on climate mitigation projects, finance and sustainability in Ghana. And to moderate all of this, we are pleased to have Leonardo Gava Mataram, who's Senior Brazil Agriculture Transition Manager at the Climate Bonds Initiative. You'll hear from me at the end where I try and wrap up very briefly, but without further ado, I'll hand over to Leonardo to kick off the discussions.
Thank you, Professor Dominic, and thank you. I'd like to thank you as well, the organizers, for having me today. It's a pleasure to be here. This is such an important topic, an interesting topic. It's cross-cutting science we're talking about. So today, topic of the day, as you guys know, carbon credits for livestock and opportunities focusing on Ghana and Nigeria. As you guys can see as well, we have a fair amount of panelists, so we are going to divide our event up in 2 different segments. Okay, so I'm going to be asking questions to our panelists in 2 different segments, and by the end, we are going to have something we are calling a lightning round. Okay, so I ask all the panelists one very specific question, and they're going to have 1 minute to reply. I invite you at the audience, please drop any questions you may have in the chat, and we are going to pick up those. The panelists are going to take a look at those as well and reply you directly. Okay, so without further ado, let's move to our first segment, which is going to be focused on exploring the current status of the market in those regions, policies and regional comparisons of carbon markets in West Africa, and of course, beyond. We have here the comparison with the Brazilian market as well. For this segment, I'll be asking questions primarily to Olly. I hope Olly is online. Daniel as well, Francisco, and Olivia. So, starting off with Olly and Daniel, I'd like to ask you, what is the current status of carbon credits and trading in Ghana and Nigeria? To each one of you, Daniel is our specialist in Ghana, and Olly is our specialist in Nigeria. And how far has the voluntary or regulated carbon markets developed? And what kinds of policies and incentives are driving progress in those regions? Okay, so starting off with Daniel, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's great to be here to share our insights and opportunities. I hope you can hear me well. But just to kickstart, I think it's important to understand that looking at carbon credits is one market that thrives on transparency, and therefore having a robust institutional arrangement and having clear-cut policies is what will enable the market to function properly. And to be able to do that, first of all, is that you must also have the policy context clearly set. And to be able to set a policy context and to be able to participate in the emerging market, one of the important things that any country or any nation must have is, first of all, to have updated its nationally determined contribution, the NDCs, and importantly, have an updated inventory to support it. So having those 2 clear policies is the first step. And the next step is also to really have a robust, as I said, and transparent institutional frameworks, clearly setting out the participation requirements and the policy context of the country, as well as the fee structure. So all of these things have been clearly identified in Ghana. And as you may be aware of, Ghana sometime 2 years ago put out a robust institutional framework, or as well as a framework to guide its market. And the framework is looking at Article 6.2, Article 6.4, now known as the Paris Agreement, crediting mechanism, and importantly, aspect of the voluntary carbon market. We are beginning to see a convergence in these markets, where even in the voluntary space, the project developers now require important government assurance, known as the corresponding adjustment on the level of credits that are generated within the scope. So in terms of what we are seeing now, and to be able to give you a clear context, one of the things that is also required is to be able to also facilitate project development by having clear guidance document to be able to facilitate project development. But to give you a context of where we are in Ghana, I would say that our pipeline currently stands at about 68 projects, or out of which about 20 of them is for voluntary carbon market, out of which I would say that out of the 68, we have 3 projects authorized. We have about 6, almost 7 of them waiting in line to be authorized within the coming month. And then also important point is that the first transfer or the first corresponding adjustment is hopefully, or the first transfer of each month will hopefully happen the next month or 2. So to just give you a clear context, this is where we are in terms of Ghana. And due to time, I would want to yield the floor to others. But the important point is that, or another highlight I want to also share with you is that the second edition of the progress report on Ghana's implementation in the international carbon market is almost ready and should be released in the coming weekend. So I urge you all to be able to look out for it. And that gives you a summary of whatever is happening in Ghana. Thank you, and over.
Thanks a lot, Daniel. It's amazing personally to see all this policy development going on in Ghana. So now handing over to Olly, who will bring us the landscape in Nigeria. Olly, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, I just had an internet outage here, so if you get that again, that might happen. But yeah, I'm just speaking in my personal capacity to just say, from my engagement with market development, which is something that we track very closely, because in Nigeria, so at the sub-regional level, it's very important because it's really the sub-regional level at which a lot of project-specific things would unfold. Where the national level is more about setting policy. And of course, we have national level colleagues here on this call, so I'll leave that. But there are 2 angles to Nigeria's carbon market development that are currently being developed. And both of them are being developed by the National Council on Climate Change, which is the coordinating body, but with input from other very relevant ministries, Federal Ministry of Environment, and specifically also the Federal Inland Revenue Service, which is to show you that this is being seen as an environmental and a revenue issue at the same time. And so, there are various consultation processes ongoing on 2 levels. One is an Article 6 process, international, state-to-state carbon credit trading against emissions tags, and the other one is the voluntary market process. So some draft guidelines for consultation for the voluntary market process were brought out at the end of last year. And taking a look at them, as someone who is interested in being in that sector will say, like 80% of what is there is ideal, in terms of a very clean, straightforward process, very legible, very understandable, very compatible with what investors would like to see and developers would like to see, but with the appropriate safeguards. 20% of it needs a little bit maybe work in certain areas, aligning with other areas, in which there is relevant legislation, or or maybe also just making a little bit more transparency in some of the stages. So, but it's quite near to completion. So we look forward to seeing that completed, because there are a lot of projects, I think, right now in Nigeria that are kind of ready to go and waiting for the kind of no objection green light at the national level. So that's really promising. There's a lot of activity. When it comes to landscape-based projects, most of this stuff has been shaped around traditional shape projects in, deferred emissions from deforestation or reforestation. Project livestock, those areas not as common. There is some market development around projects in climate smart agriculture, where you can show additionality by changing practices. But the big challenge also with the livestock sector in Nigeria is, of course, it's already a non-intensive sector. And in fact, the movement is in the other direction, because actually the pastoral livestock rearing that happens, especially in cattle, I mean, obviously cattle aren't all livestock, but in terms of emissions, the conundrum in Nigeria right now, when you look at carbon credits, is that the current practices of pastoralism, which are from a land tenure point of view, from a conflict point of view, from several other points of view, maybe seen as not ideal for a lot of people, are actually, if you were going to take all of those things out of the picture, quite compliant with regenerative agriculture and low carbon intensity livestock production. So we have this kind of interesting issue around two things pointing in slightly different directions. And I think landscape-based projects around maybe areas where herders already have rights, grazing reserves, things like that, there are opportunities there. But I think for that reason, it's a very tricky space in which to design out projects. You have to take it in a landscape where the intensity is known, where the users are known, where the landscape is defined, and where there's a relationship between the land ownership and the users, which you can easily trace. And at the same time, in the middle of a move towards sedentization, that you don't want to take things backwards in terms of climate. So I would say that is the trickiest sort of sector to work out in terms of guidelines and what can work in this space. But there are a lot of landscape-based projects pretty close to maturity in Nigeria, and there's a lot of interest in doing it, I think, and a lot of awareness in the private sector, the subnational sector, and the national sector. So you see quite a lively dialogue. But as I say, this is all, and I think it's also, I want to commend the government of Nigeria for leading with the voluntary market structure, because that is going to unlock energy the fastest. That's going to get, emissions reduction. That's going to get investment into the space. The Article 6 process is also very useful, but there aren't that many areas in which, a government-to-government federal level project is definitely the way to go. There are national parks, there are, marine landscapes, and those are there. But I think it's a really good thing that Nigeria is leading with the refining the voluntary market principles, because that's going to get people moving the fastest. So that's the overview.
Thanks, Olly. And this is super interesting as well to understand the context specific of the practice, especially because this is a market that's really dependent on the benchmark, and benchmarks, they vary a lot across countries. Thanks a lot. Now, moving forward for the more financial side of things, I'd like to call Francisco from the World Bank. We know that the World Bank just released a brief on low emissions livestock sector growth in Eastern and Southeastern Africa. The brief elaborates on how to finance responsible livestock sector development, including growing opportunities for using carbon markets as an additional incentive. And this is super important if we're driving money to the sustainability of the sector. Can you share with us some insights on how this voluntary or regulated carbon market development developed elsewhere in Africa, and what lessons can West Africa learn from these other regions? Francisco, the floor is yours as well.
Thanks a lot, Leonardo, and thanks to the organizer for having me. And thanks for advertising the publication. So we will be sharing the link in the chat so for everybody to check that out. And very happy to see so many people connected and interested in this amazing topic. So let me start with a little bit the experience of Eastern and Southern Africa, which is most of the focus of my work. So certainly in terms of the regulated market, just to confirm what probably everybody expects, I mean, I'm not aware of any country that has a carbon pricing mechanism in place, like a carbon tax affecting the livestock sector, that's for sure. But in terms of the voluntary carbon market, we see some uptake, we see some growth. For example, a couple of years ago, you could find a handful of livestock projects, carbon projects in livestock. Now you find maybe 30, with some countries really having more and more. South Africa, for example, there are quite a few. So it reflects an interest, and I think the NGOs and the operators that are running those projects are learning how to do that, and by doing so, they are increasing the numbers. On Article 6, also we see some development. There are some pilots. For example, there is a pilot in Malawi supported by the government of Switzerland to make that happen, so to kind of test how that can work in large transactions. So we also see a development there. But one thing I would like to focus on and also share with you, given that I'm from an institution that is very engaged in the carbon market space, is what we call results-based finance. And let me explain a little bit. So we, the World Bank, offer different services, financing services to the client countries that are part of the World Bank. One of those services is a fund, it's a facility that we call Biocarbon ISFL. ISFL stands for Integrated Sustainable Forest Landscape. And I'm going to also share a link in the chat so you can check it out. Some very nice information there. They have a very nice website, so you can also get more information. This facility is financed by 5 donors. And the purpose of this facility is help countries de-risk the entry to access market. And let me explain quickly how it works, because we have 2 examples in Ethiopia and Zambia that are already approved. So essentially, on the assumption that a country will be carrying out activities that will result in emission reductions, this facility helps set up the MRV systems, the regulatory frameworks, and put all the pieces together for the country to have large transactions, large jurisdictional approaches. So for example, the whole region of Oromia in Ethiopia, or the whole region of Eastern Province in Zambia. So we are talking of very vast landscapes and regions in which all sources of emission reductions are accounted for, meaning in the landscape space, meaning reduced deforestation, agriculture, and also reduced methane emissions in livestock and others. So the thing is, or the idea is to help countries capitalize on large amount of emission reductions produced in those landscapes and put it to the market. Let me finish by saying that this experience, we have, as I mentioned, 2 countries, Zambia and Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, we have 2 phases, and the first phase, which also include a purchase agreement from the bank. Also, let me clarify that we not only support the system, but also we buy some of the credits because we also have a methodology and we have an own registry. In the case of Ethiopia, we're in the process of verifying the carbon credits produced, and the second contract that we are about to sign will include livestock. So it's going to be the first country in Eastern Africa using this kind of landscape approach and jurisdictional approach to include livestock emission reductions and having carbon credits registered. When we have this point, there are 3 scenarios. One is that we buy it and we return the carbon credits to the country for them to use it against their own indices. The second scenario is that some of the donors will say, oh, I would like to take some of those emission reductions and use it for my own indices, the government of Switzerland, Norway, Germany, for example. But there is a third scenario, which is the carbon credits are put in the voluntary carbon market. And that's just what's happening now. And this is very exciting because if that happens, for example, in the future, it may transfer some capital from the north, for example, all those offsetting companies like airlines that are using carbon credits to offset their own emissions. They will be transferring, they will be buying carbon credits coming from rural communities, for example, in Ethiopia, livestock producers. By doing so, we will be generating a channel of financing for small communities. And more information you can find in this publication that we'll be sharing. I'm certainly happy to share more details. There are 3 lessons learned, and I'm going to be very quick here that are already mentioned here all the colleagues, but we need to ensure rigorous methodology and measurements. The data are very challenging, and that's important. So that's the first lesson. We need to secure a high integrity in terms of social environmental standards. And finally, a fair share of benefit with communities. All projects include communities receiving from 50 to 70% of the carbon revenues for them to decide. By doing so, you create an incentive for community to do things differently and to take advantage of these mechanisms. Let me stop here, Leonardo. Back to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Francisco. And again, super interesting this, as we know, I mean, if we are funding more sustainable practices, this has a cost, and carbon credits for sure is one of the revenue streams. And it's amazing to see how it's being embedded in more complex, but more widespread financial instruments and financial strategies as well. Thanks a lot for this. Now, moving forward to another fellow Brazilian in the call, Olivia. I have a question for you. So your company, ERA, has been developing nature-based carbon projects in Brazil and very well, per se. What parallels do you see with West Africa, and what critical steps enabled market establishment in Brazil? The floor is yours.
Thanks. First of all, thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to share our experience at ERA. I'm just going to briefly introduce myself to bring some context from my point of view. So my name is Olivia. I'm head of operations at ERA. ERA is a woman-led project developer here in Brazil, a company that works with carbon and biodiversity credits and women's empowerment units. So we have a focus on the Cerrado biome, which is the most biodiversity savanna, home to at least 5% of the world's species. And the Cerrado has lost half of its native vegetation due to agriculture and deforestation, mainly soy production and cattle ranching, so which is 3 or 4 times has better revenues than carbon projects. So that's a challenge to implement like sustainable practices. I watched the first webinar and much was discussed about ALM, so agricultural land management, carbon projects, as being the option of generating credits for agriculture. But moving towards an integrated system is also an option, and that's what we are trying to do here at ERA, and will be my focus here on the answer your question. So in my experience, 2 critical steps could enable carbon projects development. One is to build a collaborative effort with all players, so off-takers agreement, investors, project developers, government, landowners, and communities, everyone in the same table with the same context, and trying to build a strong project. So, and the other one is related to the figure that we can see in our screen, is to build a strong and clear value proposition for the landowners. So here on the screen, we can see the value proposition that we built for one of our projects in Brazil, showing that the program brings a value for the landowners, how we want to change the degraded pasture for an integrated livestock system, and what are the program benefits for the landowner. This is important because the carbon projects here in Cerrado are competing with soy and cattle. And I told you that cattle and soy production has like 3 or 4 times better revenues than like restoration projects. So we want to show that to the landowners and really be clear on how it's possible to integrate both activities, cattle and carbon, in the same project, in the same system. Yeah, I think that's it.
Thanks a lot, Olivia. This is super interesting. This landscape approach on integrated management is something that is growing a lot in Brazil right now, and for sure had lots of potential to be integrated in other regions as well. Thanks for the initiative and for the overview. Now, moving forward for the last question of this first segment, I'd like to ask Daniel and Olly again on the visions on Ghana and Nigeria. And my question is, what do you both think are the primary barriers to carbon market development in those 2 countries, in West Africa and your countries? And as one of those barriers and challenges, who would be the potential sellers and buyers in this ecosystem for your country? So let's start again with Daniel and the vision from Ghana.
Okay.
Daniel.
Okay, thank you. So let me start off from where you ended, right? So in terms of having buyers and sellers, so who are the buyers? Those who are interested really as either can be in two groups, sovereign or government, or a non-sovereign, that's private sector. In terms of sovereign governments, we're working with about 5 governments: Singapore, Switzerland, Sweden, South Korea, and then Liechtenstein, right? But important point is that apart from Singapore and then apart from Singapore and Liechtenstein, the rest of the governments that we're working with are not interested in NBS and also credits that come from agriculture, right? So that's also an important point to get to know what these buyers are interested in. So that is another level. In terms of the challenges that we are beginning to see, mainly the challenges revolve around about 2 or 3 areas. The first point is that indeed it is important to also highlight that carbon credit or this market is a results-based payment market where you must have investment or the capital to develop a project and generate the emission reductions before the carbon revenues will then come in. So having that patient capital to develop the project is what has been a big challenge for the local project developers. But what we are beginning to see is that there are various financing, innovative financing arrangements that are beginning to come up or crop up. And this is because the government has, or the Carbon Market Office has actively engaged the financial institutions to try and put their interest and get them to see the opportunities in the sector. That's number one. Number two is that having clear-cut procedures to guide project developers across the development phase as well as the implementation phase is very, very important. So the government also is developing guidance on developing carbon market projects on certain specific technologies. That is also supposed to facilitate project development and then also reduce the challenges around where to start, where to go, and the other issues around project information that is not available, readily available. Another important point also to highlight is that it's difficult to really place a handle on this, but another important thing that the office is doing is to really work with various actors that are such as the scientists that are in the country to develop project data and make it readily available to facilitate project development. So that, for example, if you're in Brazil and you want to come into Ghana to develop a project, you don't need to come and do the legwork. That legwork would have been done for you to really facilitate that project development. So that's also one area that we're actively working in. So let me leave it here and yield the floor to others. If there are any specific questions, I'm happy to take them. Thank you, and over.
Thanks, Daniel. Again, now moving forward to Olly from the Nigeria perspective. Olly, the floor is yours again.
Sorry, I lost the reception a little bit when you were setting up the question. So if you could just prompt me again on what this point should address.
Sure, no problem. So the focus here is on what are the primary barriers for the development of the market in the region, and thinking as one of the barriers, what are the potential sellers and buyers in this ecosystem for Nigeria?
Okay, I mean, I think it's a very different situation to countries where you have large plantation or estate economies, you know, where the buyers the sellers are very clear and the buyers are also very clear. There are buyers out there for clear additionality, high integrity credits in Nigeria. There are companies, both Nigerian and overseas, based in Nigeria and who do business with Nigeria. That's clear there is an appetite for developing credits. The question of, I think it's clarity above all is the barrier. You know, we would need to say, how can we evolve livestock sector projects, you know, that are very clear to measure against Nigeria's AFOLU objectives. So there's a measurement, measurement capacity in there against benchmarking, and that's something that's been worked out across the board, I think, in Nigeria. You know, how to different areas of government becoming better at carbon budgeting and benchmarking. So there's that, but it's also, as I said before, the difficulty of finding the right project. Where is the project where you can see a livestock practice that has a negative emissions potential that you can clearly make an improvement to. You need a lot of clarity on this. You know, you need to make sure that the set of actors rearing the livestock are contiguous with the people managing the landscape rather than, you know, pastoralists that are coming and going. You need to see that the baseline scenario, and this is very tricky because, as I said, the baseline scenario is quite low intensity pastoralism, which already looks good from a carbon perspective, even if it's problematic from others. And if you're talking of sedimentization, you may intensify emissions. There are, you know, intensive cattle rearing projects being developed right now, and you can also see ways of making them a lot more climate friendly and involve more mitigation than the other ways would do. But what's the reference case if the project is a new project? The reference case is as against it would have otherwise been. And I'm not sure if that's allowable under a lot of voluntary market methodologies. If you say we're developing a project that didn't exist before, the version of the project is now better than the version of the project it was, is that an allowable base case? This is something that you have to go to the voluntary market regulators to get clarity on, because you're comparing a thing that you are going to do with an imaginary thing that didn't happen. And this is always where, you know, we get into problems with the carbon credit market, because the reference case is, you know, if you look at forest protection projects, has already got people in trouble in some places. So this is a very difficult one. So it reduces us down to the viable projects where there is some livestock rearing going on, that you can see a scope for improvement and a defined landscape that exists, you know. There's also things, of course, like poultry production, which are already very intensive in Nigeria. We have a very intensive poultry sector, and, you know, you can decarbonize aspects of that sector. You know, this is also livestock. You can decarbonize supply chains around that sector. So there's a lot that you can do, small ruminants as well. There's a lot you can do with livestock transport, which is also kind of closely related. So I think we should also look at the supply chains that fit into the sector, not just the landscape-based projects, because that's a big one. That's a big one. Utilization, processing, support structures, even just decarbonizing things like cold storage around the ones that already exist. So these are probably the low-hanging fruits in a lot of cases. The large landscape-based projects, to be a bit more selective about which ones may be viable.
Perfect, Olly. Super thanks for this. Super interesting. Again, clarity and lack of projects. This is one of the main challenges we have for the sustainable finance market as a whole, not just carbon credit. So thanks a lot for bringing this up. I would like to extend this question a little bit to Francisco. What are your takes on this buy side, Francisco, from the World Bank?
You know what? Thank you again. And one message I would like to leave with you is that carbon finance or carbon markets is one of the sources of revenues to finance a more comprehensive transformation and development in the livestock sector towards more sustainability. You know, in African countries, the climate question is more focused on adaptation. I mean, actually, building resilience is the name of the game. And mitigation gains can be achieved, but, you know, compared to the global north, it's very little. So for us in the bank, what we have been trying to do is to use the mitigation gains and the emission reduction schemes and carbon credit schemes, like the one I mentioned before, as a way to mobilize financing to finance resilience. So in other words, what we are trying to do here is to use the mitigation gains to finance adaptation, to finance a better livestock sector that also create livelihoods opportunities, more income, more job, more opportunities for many people. In that framework, the carbon market, certainly, it's one of the options along many others. And to make it happen, we need all the ingredients that all my colleagues and fellow panelists have been discussing. So one important thing to keep in mind, and then, is that, and the opportunity that I see, and maybe to start with, is large landscape projects and programs like the ones that we have been supporting and we see growing in the Eastern African context can help countries tap into the Article 6 transactions, large transactions. So because of many of the projects that we have seen, livestock projects are pretty small. In Ethiopia, for example, we have a contract for 1.8 million emission reductions 1.8 million. And in Zambia, our contract is with 3 million. And if we achieve those large scale transactions, certainly countries can make a very good case to trade those with other countries in the north and use the Article 6, you know. So that, if that happens in the future, and I'm sure that's going to happen, going to open a great opportunity to financing this sector, and all the investments are needed at the community level and in the different parts of the value chains. So I think, but finally, we need to put this in the context of a strategy where climate adaptation is of paramount importance for the continent, and where carbon markets is one of the financing opportunities, but certainly not an end in itself and something that we can just use as a silver bullet to solve all the problems. Thanks a lot. Back to you, Leonardo.
Thanks, Mrs. No, this is very interesting, because you usually see mitigation gains as being something to reinvest on more mitigation, and this is not the case. We're talking about completely different context, and this is super important as well. And completely agree when you say it's not a silver bullet. It's one of the tools we have in a very complex environment, but for sure is one of the strongest tools we have right now. I'd like to thank you all for this for the insights during this first segment. Now we are going to the second segment. Okay, just a reminder for the audience: if you have a question, please drop it in the chat directed at one of the panelists, and they are going to make the most to reply you all. Our second segment will focus on the implementation challenges and inclusive participation. Okay, for the carbon market. In this segment, I'll be asking questions to Jack Devlin, Robert, Ibrahim, and again, Olivia. You also have insights on the second segment. My first question today will be directed to Jack. Your group in Africa, Africa Nature Investors, have been working on land-based carbon projects to develop an afforestation, reforestation, and revegetation carbon project in Nigeria, Gashaka Gupti National Park. Sorry if I mispronounce anything here. A particular focus of this project is fire and grazing management to regenerate the park's forest and protect its ecosystems. This is super interesting. What approach have you been taking to measure and monitor land-based emissions in this particular landscape? Jack, the floor is yours.
Hey, yeah, thank you. So yeah, as you mentioned, I work for an NGO named Africa Nature Investors Foundation, also called ANI. And we are a Nigerian founded and led conservation organization with co-management agreements for a couple of national parks here in Nigeria. The one that I work in and am based in is called Gashaka Gumti National Park. It's along the border with Cameroon. And it's a mosaic of montane forests, montane grasslands, savanna woodlands, all these different ecosystems. And the project that we're looking at, it's not a directly, I would say, cattle-focused project, but what we are looking at is the park has been heavily degraded over the past 20 or 30 years, primarily through anthropogenic fires set by cattle grazers moving through the landscapes, which obviously are part of savannas, but the number, the frequency, and the severity are leading to an eventual degradation of a lot of these landscapes, as well as just cattle grazing within the park in sensitive ecosystems, causing damage to those ecosystems as well. So a lot of, say, the montane grasslands, some of the savanna woodlands are anthropogenically maintained. And so what our project is looking to do is to basically reestablish the park so that it is properly maintained, allow forests to naturally regenerate to what they would be. And the main activities for that are going to be managing grazing and managing fire. And so we do a lot of engagement kind of with the different stakeholders in the landscape, particularly pastoralists. We're planning on doing a lot of community level grazing and fire management plans and things like that. But for monitoring, so I guess that's the background, because for monitoring, what we're really monitoring is the park and forest growth rather than, say, emissions from the cattle sector itself. We have been very fortunate to be supported by the Nature Conservancy in a lot of our work, which is an American-based, one of the biggest conservation NGOs in the world. And they have been helping us develop a lot of remote sensing tools to be able to monitor these indicators that we want to do. The biggest one being we've been using satellite imagery to both monitor fire and track fire, but also build a biomass model. And the biomass model uses a variety of kind of different remote sensing things, but canopy cover, tree height, all this type of stuff to end up getting to basically a proxy value that we can try to use to determine these biomass levels. And through that, we've been able to track the historic trends and also is what we're planning to use moving forward as well. We also do ground truthing with that. So we've had teams come in and set up control plots where they go out and they actually measure how much biomass is in an area, match that with the model and use that to train and build accuracy. But one of the big challenges with that is that there's not a lot of ground truthing data at the moment. So it's kind of starting that from scratch. And that's what TNC has been very helpful with, is this is a very, understudied region in terms of those kind of analyses.
Thanks, Jack. And this is super, super interesting. As Olivia was talking earlier, there's a very, very good parallel between this and the Brazilian Cerrado, because one of the main issues we have as well is overgrazing and degradation of land. So there's huge opportunity in the Cerrado, as there's a huge opportunity in Africa in that direction. Thanks a lot. Now I'm moving forward to Robert and hear a little bit about the Ghana perspective on this. Robert, how are carbon GHG emissions being measured and monitored in Ghana? And is there much monitoring for the land-based sector in the country? Robert, please.
Yeah. Okay, good afternoon to all. And well, for the measuring of the we use the methodologies in the standards, which are the CDM, the VCS, and then the gold standards methodologies. That's what we use to do the measurements. So all this is spelled out, and we follow the rules. And for monitoring, we also use the monitoring system, the monitoring reporting, and the verification systems that are in the methods from the standards that is being used. So if you are doing a project, a mitigation project for, let's say, Vera, and you are using the CDM, one of the CDMs to do as a method to see how you are reducing the carbon emissions, you follow the monitoring, and it comes
I think
with
we
the
lost
documents
Robert.
and how long it takes if it's here.
I don't know if that's from my side, but I think we lost Robert for a bit.
It's the internet, so sometimes it goes off. Sometimes it's straightforward. Hello, can you get me, please? Can you hear?
Yeah, now we can.
Is it clear, Leonardo?
Now I can hear you.
So I'm saying that
Now we can anymore.
Can you hear me now? Hello? Hello, Leonardo. Can you hear me?
Hey, Robert, the internet is breaking a bit, so I'm going to ask. Now I can. It's a little broke up to me, but if you can
hear me now.
Yeah, perhaps you can turn off your camera. Let's see if that's better.
Okay. All right.
Try now.
So can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, better.
Yeah. So I'm saying that the measuring, we follow the methods, but the methodologies according to the standard that we want to use. Example, if we want to do the waste to energy projects, where we want to turn like solid waste and agro waste into energy, which will be added to the national grid. And we decide to use the gold standards. We have to follow the measurements and then the implementations of through the methods in the standards, and then the monitoring phase of the monitoring, and then the reporting and the verification, which can be yearly, and then that means taking data of the biomass being used before it's being turned into the energy, and then the reduction, the carbon emission reduction that is given. So we use the methodologies that are on the approved standards to do both the measuring and then the monitoring.
Perfect, Robert. Thanks a lot. This is very clear. So in Ghana, of course, you guys using all the standards and measurements that are the benchmarks in the second. This is super important. This is super nice. Just following our schedule, I'd like to move to Ibrahim. Ibrahim, you have a remarkable career of more than 30 years working on livestock policy in Nigeria. So I'd like to ask you directly, what are Nigeria's current livestock development priorities, and how do you think carbon credit schemes could benefit the sector in your country? So Ibrahim, the floor is yours as well. I'm not sure Ibrahim is in the call right now. We had him in the beginning. Let me just check here. No, I think he dropped, maybe an internet connection problem. So I'll move to the next question. And my next question is to Olivia. Olivia, again, we know that it's important that carbon incentives do not cause unintended harms. Okay, so carbon schemes have been accused of greenwashing or benefit distribution over time. We know that. How we can ensure ensure just and fair participation across diverse stakeholders for this kind of projects, and particularly women, smallholders, and indigenous people, which in Brazil, as you know, it's a huge problem. Can you share any lessons from your work in the country? The floor is yours.
Yes, Leo, I could speak hours about it. Yeah, let me try to be brief. I think it's important to address that in Brazil, carbon initiatives for the agriculture sector have mainly been focused on medium or big landowners. So many factors are related to that, but mainly the difficulties regarding land tenure and legal documentation. Therefore, the participation of smallholders, it's more related to co-benefit certifications, such as CCB, than with carbon certifications, such as VCS, for example. At ERA, we have experience with CCB, with our RED Plus program, called Red Cerrado program, which is a well-known certification that addresses community and biodiversity issues. But we also have experience with the W Plus methodology, which generates W Plus units that can also be sold together with carbon units, such as CCB label cans. I will drop the link from the certification here in the chat. Yes. As time is of essence here, I will talk a little bit about our experience using the Women's Empowerment methodology, trying to bring some lessons. For instance, the W Plus certification rules that 20% of the revenues from the sales must be returned to the woman benefited from the program. So in this methodology, there is a clear rule regarding benefit sharing. This methodology also has gender-specific indicators that through gender analysis and gender action plans address the dynamics and challenges that women face. This is a very important step to ensure women's participation in the program. We also learned here to ensure that women have access to the necessary resource to participate in the program. Depending on the target group, we offer support on transportation, childcare, and sometimes even daily payment to women's participation. These actions heavily increased the number of women participating in the program. I think the main lesson here is that understanding the target group dynamics and challenges is key for meaningful participation and benefit sharing.
Perfect, Olivia. It's so great to hear that those aspects are being taken into consideration in those projects. I'd like to extend this question a few minutes to Jack. Jack, what are your takes on the subject?
Yeah, thanks. And kind of a very similar echo to what Olivia was saying, but where we are, where Gashaka Gumti is, tends to be a very kind of patriarchal society. Women often are not represented in traditional leadership structures, often do not own land, kind of all these challenges that are also some of the main avenues that people benefit through carbon credits. And so we have had to be very mindful and very deliberate in how we go about that. Luckily, it's one of our main focuses beyond the carbon project to provide equal opportunities and to kind of uplift community members. And the carbon project that we're doing is really about, it's about protecting the park and hopefully helping to restore that, but also driving sustainable development in communities and providing opportunity. So because of that, we have already kind of done extensive engagement, specifically targeting kind of benefiting women. We have 42 village savings and loans groups kind of scattered throughout different communities in the park. We have a community liaison team that engages with those groups on a regular basis and have dedicated women staff who help lead those meetings. And so kind of through that, we have been able to establish kind of, first of all, a very good relationship with a lot of these groups, but second of all, a reputation for that as well. But all of that is to say that it has been that we have to be very deliberate, like I said, about those actions that we're taking. Because if we're just kind of going through maybe the regular CCB standards or something, if we're just engaging with traditional leadership, all those benefits are likely not going to reach women in these communities. So it does have to be a very mindful approach that we take. And we're going to continue doing that in the future. We have plans for doing focus group discussions and everything like that to make sure that we capture all demographics, because in addition to women, there are other vulnerable demographics in the area. So yeah.
Oh, thanks, Jack. Amazing that all of this is being mapped, that are taking this into consideration. It's great to hear that. I would just like to go back for a second to Ibrahim, check if he can speak. I reckon he has some problems with mic or something like this. Can you hear us, Ibrahim? I think we are experiencing some technical problems here, but we can always come back to Ibrahim. I'm moving forward to our next section, which is, if I'm following this correctly, a poll to our audience. So we have two questions, and Vanessa helped me here on how we are going to display this. Yeah. So first question, and everyone in the audience and also our panelists, feel free to reply to those questions. Our first question is, what are the key technical challenges that need to be addressed to develop carbon markets for livestock? So guys, feel free to reply to that one. Would be great to hear from you. Just giving you a few seconds.
Yeah. I don't know. Can I come in here? Robert, can I come in?
Someone is talking. I cannot identify who is talking. Sorry.
It's Robert. Did you want to add something, Robert?
Yeah. Do you have some takes on this? Please feel free.
I was trying to ask if we can have, if there have been pilot projects on how to do the measurements and monitoring, maybe a pilot. If we can have some pilots also in our end, either Nigeria, Ghana, or something, to see how it will come out. It's a suggestion. I don't know if you've done something.
You mean from the Brazilian side? In general, pilots or examples? Sorry, I did not get this.
Sorry, Leonardo, maybe let me come in here. So my understanding from Robert is that he's asking if there can be demonstration pilots of technologies and the potential emission reduction from these technologies within countries, or if there is any working group that is already doing something like that. And my answer to Robert is that we are already some of these things being done in countries. So, for example, if you take the Ghana context, the CSIR is working to develop a comprehensive pack that looks at all the technologies that can happen within the livestock and agriculture sector on one pack, and then be able to also estimate the emission reduction potential of these technologies. So there are some things that are being done, maybe making them visible and making them widely available across the sectors is what is important going forward. So maybe that's my answer to Robert. Thank you.
No, this is super interesting, and I encourage everyone to drop. Sorry, I encourage everyone in the audience to drop any examples or pilots or links to good examples in the chat, so we can all benefit of this information. I think this is a space for networking as well. So, guys, moving to the next question. I'm going to ask one general question, and each one of the panelists will have 1 minute to reply to this general question. And this is a very broad question, and we have touched upon this before. As we talked before, carbon markets are one of the tools in a broad sustainable finance environment that can be used to generate revenue that could be either be spent on more mitigation or adaptation, as Francisco very well highlighted this before. So my question to you all is, what role will carbon markets play in providing accessible funding to the sector in your region? Of course, we're talking about mostly Africa and Olivia here, Brazil, in the next decade. So what role will carbon markets play in providing accessible funding to the sector in your region in the next decade? So looking forward. I would like to start with Olly. So we have a timer here, 60 seconds. So let's try to keep your responses in 60 seconds and close this incredible discussion. So Olly, the floor is yours.
I hope that the role that they'll play, I don't know, but I hope, is to make available some sustainable long-term finance for things that other people otherwise won't finance. So for it to be a big multilateral World Bank or AFDB or whatever project or Jeff project is kind of huge and cumbersome, takes ages to prepare. For it to be a small-scale agricultural project, you get short money that can't do everything it needs to do and isn't there for long enough. So there is this gap in the middle for long money that has the appetite to fund landscape restoration or long-term agri or livestock projects. And only the voluntary carbon market are really going to be in that space. It's really, really hard to find it anywhere else. But voluntary carbon markets have the potential to be dynamic and plug that middle and medium-term gap. Thank you.
Thanks, Olly. I hear you. And long-term debt and long-term money is one of the key challenges we have for the sector everywhere, I would say. So moving forward, Daniel, and counting.
Okay, thank you. What's my take? So my take is quite simple and aligned with the previous speaker on what needs to be done and how carbon revenues can finance it. But the important point is that maybe to share with you what we have seen so far. So we have about 6 projects that have generated an investment potential of over $850 million. For me, it shows that this is a way to go to really transform and achieve low carbon development within our region. But another point is that we ought to know that the carbon revenues or carbon market is not a silver bullet. It ought to be complemented with other forms of financing arrangement to be able to transition towards what we are looking for. Another point is that the VCM also offers a great potential for the market, and we think that the government must work around supporting development within the VCM. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. Moving forward to Francisco.
Thanks a lot. As in many agricultural systems, the key for success for farmers is to have productive systems that are marketable, that they can generate revenues. That will not change here. What we need the carbon finance for is to have an add-on, an extra incentive to do things right in terms of sustainability, to protect grassland, restore forest, reduce deforestation, have better and more controlled heads, because when we see the increase of emissions, especially in Eastern African countries, it's because there are so many cattle. They need to have fewer and more productive cattle. So again, the substance is to have more productive farmers making money, basically, from what they produce, have a set of policies behind supporting them, and having the carbon market, having a add-on to increase in sustainability and environmental sustainability and resilience. Thank you.
Amazing, Francisco. Thank you. Handing over to Olivia.
Hi, I think carbon markets can provide crucial funding for the agriculture sector by incentivizing sustainable practices like agroforestry, integrated systems, and also conservation projects. The agriculture sector depends heavily on weather and has a high risk connected with climate change. So that diversifying the income is one of the ways to decrease risks and bring sustainability to the landowner. For big farmers, the carbon market is more developed, and this whole of diversifying the income and bringing funds is more evident. But we need to unlock the participation of smallholders, women, indigenous people, more than only participating in co-benefits program. I think this will be key to provide real opportunities for funding sustainable practices in the agriculture sector.
Thanks, Olivia. Now, Robert.
Yeah. Okay, for me, it's important for the carbon credits in the livestock sector to grow with the carbon markets, as is being done with the climate smart agriculture for farming. The livestock aspects to sector to have to also enjoy and get the development, the technological know-how, and then knowledge sharing. And in Ghana, we are well, the structures are in place, and then the support services from other sectors, both government bodies, carbon markets developer. We are ready to do such projects here in Ghana. That's what I want to say.
Thanks, Robert. Thanks a lot. I think we had a problem with our timer on the screen. Finally, Jack.
Great. Yeah. So, I mean, for us, the reason we have to do a carbon, or we want to do a carbon project, is because the park has become degraded, and that's largely because so much of the land outside has also become degraded. And the reason for that is because these resources, you know, are more valuable being used than they are being conserved at the moment. And so really for the future, you know, what we really want to see is value being provided to those resources staying as they are, because there are so many, you know, additional ecosystem services that they provide as well. And carbon credits is a way to bridge that gap. We're also looking forward to, you know, biodiversity credits and other things that could potentially also capture the whole range of value that these things provide. But yeah, it's going to be very critical for this whole region.
Thanks, Jack. And thank you all for this amazing discussion we had today. As you may have seen, livestock is a challenging sector. It has risks, many risks. Carbon market has challenges, it has opportunities. What we need to do is actually dialogue, finding the best solutions and finding case studies that actually work to be replicated and adapted as well. So this is what I wanted to discuss with you guys today. Thank you all again. I'll hand over to Professor Dominic for the closing remarks of this webinar. Thank you all.
Thank you, Leonardo, and I'd like to thank your experts steering of complicated debate, including the technical difficulties, which sometimes are unavoidable. I'd like to also thank the distinguished panel of experts for some really interesting insights. I hesitate to try. I mean, we are running a bit ahead of schedule, and I normally have 5 minutes. I'll try and summarize my key takeaways, although I hesitate to try and do justice to everybody's really important contributions. I heard from Daniel and Olly that there are inevitably institutional frameworks being developed in both countries. Daniel mentioned the NDCs, which sets the overall, again, envelope of country commitments to emissions reduction. And he pointed us towards the likely development of the voluntary carbon market and accompanying regulation in Ghana, which is encouraging to hear. I didn't hear him say that agriculture would be off the agenda for the long term, so there's some encouragement, and I get the sense that there is some appetite for exploring land-based and agricultural credits in Ghana. Olly likewise gave us a quick tour d'horizon of some of the institutional developments there, and interestingly pointed us to the fact that the Federal Inland Revenue Service in Nigeria have got its eyes on the development of potential revenue streams from emissions trading, so that's always a good sign. And an indicator of a maturing sector and revenue stream. But at the same time, he was very, I think he was very insightful in pointing us to some of the problems with livestock and the reference level of emissions reduction that we're talking about when we talk about countries with large smallholder sectors and pastoral systems, and a difficulty in inventing or in identifying reasonable reductions in bona fide projects that started from something other than the baseline level of production in the sector, and I think that's an interesting challenge for the livestock sector in sub-Saharan Africa. But nevertheless, he said there's a good private sector engagement and awareness in Nigeria, and a lively dialogue going on. And so again, I'm quite encouraged that this is going to be a growing research area in both countries. I think the conversation then switched from sometimes to more general challenges, as we saw with some of the other presentations around the land-based sector generally, and land degradation and measurement and remote sensing, and all of the issues that we somehow touched on in the first webinar. Francisco then came and told us more about other funding modalities, which I think is probably the World Bank specialization anyway, and the idea that you could facilitate compliance and funding at scale. And he told us about the interesting experience in Ethiopia, which is bundling up credits and then bundling up emissions reduction potential, and then offering that to different funding sources nationally and internationally. And that is absolutely fascinating. And I guess that's a specific institutional arrangement that allows countries to kind of sidestep to some extent some of the micro level MRV problems that we might have been discussing on a smaller project by project basis. But again, he emphasized the need for integrity in this market at all levels, and I think that's a key takeaway. Whoever's offering the credits and whoever's buying them still really relies on some transparency and integrity. We heard about various barriers. I don't suppose I can really dwell on those in the time that I've got. I think I've probably taken 5 minutes already, but I'd like to re-emphasize the fact that we have learned a lot thanks to our expert participants. And I've got the general feeling that there is one way in terms of the direction of travel in relation to emissions reductions and the relationship with climate smart agriculture and adaptation as well, and that there will likely be more emphasis and more market participation in terms of technology for measuring emissions reductions at scale using remote sensing and AI and modeling, and I think it was made as a key point, developing sharing of knowledge between academics in Brazil and, for example, and in Africa. I think a lot of the modelling is happening and can be transferable, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. And countries don't have to reinvent models and methodologies where they already exist and can be transferred. So that is kind of part of the ethos of this project and this event. And in the first webinar, I pointed participants to a funding call in relation to a follow-on from these two webinars. I don't know if we can put that link in the chat. I'll try and do it. But if you would like to get in touch with us about that and to further discuss the topic and that call from Innovate UK, which has funded this event and the previous one, please leave a comment in the chat. We'll share that link, and we will make sure to share the meeting recording with everyone in about a week's time, and we'll share a final meeting report of the two events once it's complete.